Take me.
Oh, great. You got that voice. We're going to set this to display mode. We're going to get a laser pointer so I can highlight things. So welcome to everyone. Welcome especially to anyone who is a newcomer, anyone who just hasn't sewn something before. In the SCA, I am Magdalena van den Velde. You can call me Magdalena or Magdalene, however you want to. And I am here to give you a class on how Tunic. So how to make the most basic of tunics. If you have questions at any point during the class, please just speak up, raise your hand, whatever you need to do, and let's get right in. So tunics, why do we go so into tunics? And that is because tunics are the most basic, typical piece of garb that a person is going to be wearing other than just having some fabric wrapped around you. It is this idea of taking something that is inherently flat and shaping it just enough so that it stays on the human body. I'm going to show a bunch of extant tunics, and then we will get into how you can sew them yourself. In each of these slides, I've tried to give, where the tunic was found, when it dates to, what it's made out of, which museum it came from, why I'm featuring it. And so all of these you can find in museum collections yourself. It's the wonderful thing that museums are doing with making their collections so available online. This first one is a child's tunic, but it has all of the essential shapes and things that we see. One thing that you can notice that catches my eye right off the bat is that this one definitely does have a seam where the arms have been sewn in at the shoulders. It has a very basic open hole neckline, and it's not too incredibly large for the proportions. This one is at the V&A Museum. And so many of these tunics have gorgeous, gorgeous weaving. They're made out of very plain wool or plain linen, but they have these very typical decorative elements. This one looks to me so much more like a man's tunic. And this one is interesting, and I love it in the collection because you can see that it has this seam halfway down where they have attached two pieces of fabric together. It also has a great trim detail. I mean, look at these figures all the way down in this woven trim, and they're right under the neckline. Again, simple slit open neckline, very wide body. And then the sleeves have been folded over. I can't tell whether or not there is a shoulder seam on this tunic, but yeah, just super simple woven linen.
And chances are good that seam across the middle is to adjust it from a previous length. It was
Yes.
probably a good deal longer, and somebody decided I want it shorter,
Yeah, you
rather than
see,
just blousing it up over a belt or a sash.
yeah, great comment. And that is totally common on a lot of these. You'll see a line tacked halfway through, and they will mention in the description of the item that it does have just that tuck. And sometimes it tells you exactly what the dimensions are of it, which is also just very cool when dealing with these actual clothes. This one, alas, only has a black and white photo, and I failed to let you know where this came from. 6th to 7th century wool with the tapestry woven elements. This one is neat, again, that tuck across the middle, can't detect any sign of a shoulder seam. But this one also, it's got a rounded neckline with this band of trim attached to that, rounding it out. It has a band at the bottom. And honestly, with either the way that it is draped on the mannequin or the way that it's actually made, I would guess that this one might have some shaping to it, so it might not be just a straightforward rectangle. And speaking of things that are not just straightforward rectangles, another tunic from a similar era, this one has some fantastic details to it. Again, so many of these are coming from various finds in Egypt. So these are very location specific, but they're wonderful exemplars of the overall garment. Made out of linen, wool, and silk for the detailing. This one is fun because it has some sleeve shaping to it. So you've got things coming down for something tighter at the wrist. You've got curvature here next to the body. It's not super wide. I mean, this looks like, just a person's regular shirt laid out. It does have some gores sewn in at the sides to give the skirt and the hem a little bit more width. And I love this neckline, the fact that it has, fairly close to the neck, but an opening on the side so that you've got that extra space to get your head through. And just probably this is where the silk element is coming in, the binding that's used around the neckline and at the wrists. And so for here, you can see that from the hem to the top, it is just barely over a meter. And then from arm to arm, it is about 1.5 meters. So I would honestly have to say that this was probably a tunic sized for a child, just based on those dimensions. I threw in this one because I would love to see more from the other hemisphere. And there are some amazing tunics that are in museums coming out of Peru from the Inca Empire. This one just, it really, really stands out while having still some of the same elements. So from shoulder to hem, less than a meter. So not a very long garment, but from side to side, more than double that. So these proportions are very interesting. I loved the simple vertical neck opening on this, same as the horizontal one in principle, just a very interesting stylistic difference. And you get some amazing weaving being expressed still around the hem. So that one's 7th to 9th century. This one is slightly of possibly dubious provenance from what I've heard. Allegedly 12th century, worn by St. Francis of Assisi, held in Italy. And what this was interesting to me is very, very plain, large, round neckline. And you see the large long triangular gores under the arm and down by the sides. So you can see how the overall shape of tunics has changed a lot over these centuries, and we're starting to see a transition to the more trapezoidal, wider skirted shapes that we get in these centuries. This one is, just stunning, and I'm trying, I'm tempted to make it myself. From an art history museum in Vienna, Italian from the middle of the 13th century, made out of silk. And they analyzed it, verifying that it was dyed with indicatins and madder. So this one, height about 1.5 meters, seem reasonable, but still that breadth from arm to arm, this is going, full length of 1.7 meters. This one again, it's got an interesting treatment at the neck so that you've got something that is very, very close to the neck in terms of shaping, with a slit to provide extra space to get the head through. But I mean, just the gorgeous contrast of the dark blue silk of the body and the red with gold trim. It's just, love it.
And don't forget the thousands of pearls on the cuff.
You know, and I'm probably not gonna sew 1,000 pearls onto my own version of this, but we'll see where that gets. I mean, I almost wonder, like, are these going to be jewels? Are they spangles?
They're enamels. They're
Oh,
little round enamels that have been sewn on.
wow. And then we're getting very much into basically the peak almost of rectangular construction in terms of tunics. So this is the Boxton man's tunic, which is middle of the 14th century wool, and has, again, rounded neck opening, great for getting the head through, the sleeves that are tapered down to fit nicely at the wrist, gussets under the arm, which are sometimes just a godsend. And this one has a very plain, tightly fitted rectangle cutout for the body, but with slits the front, back, and the sides, and gores inserted in order to give it that shaping. And for anyone who has done some rectangular construction, we know that it is just a fantastic way to really fit the body very well and use a minimum amount of precious fabrics. And suddenly, there we go. So in terms of tunics throughout the ages, there is a great article that I will need to post that was written by this marvelous person with a name that I cannot pronounce. But this is just showing the various shapes and types of tunic variations. And you can just see how many different things are possible. Everything from, you know, single piece, straight arms, straight body, different styles of trim elements, to leading towards a more trapezoidal body, gores inserted at the sides or not, things left open a little bit, multiple gores inserted, different trapezoids for the arms. So all of this is to get something that fits the body nicely, allows for free movement at the shoulders, movement around the legs, whether you're walking or riding a horse. So that is what history has led us to. So looking at these in a little bit of a different way, I want to talk about 3 tunics specifically. So first, there is this 8th century described as a child's tunic. It's got the stripes, which I love. It has got a tuck in the middle to shorten it. But the reason that I wanted to insert this photo specifically is simply because it shows the tunic and then it shows it next to a standard 8.5 by 11 potentially piece of paper or similar. I mean, maybe this is from the British Museum, so maybe it's that weird A4 size, but also literally right next to a measuring tape, so that you can get an idea of the fact that this tunic, just the body, is 3 pages in breadth, and the sleeves from top to bottom are basically half of the short side of a page. So you've got something that really does have a huge wide body and very narrow sleeves. And one thing that I see both in this example and some others, it might be due to the wear, but I see it so much that I think it is deliberate and it makes sense, is having an opening right here under the arm, which is really essential to having free movement around that arm side. Because as we get into body measurements in just a few minutes, anyone who hasn't sewn before, you'll learn a big secret about effective sleeves. So I love this tunic. And also the neckline, it's hard to exactly say, but to me, with the way that this contrast fabric is laid out, it makes me feel like there is a round opening and then slits on either side to help with getting the head through, and possibly maybe some sort of fastening to close it afterwards, but I'm not sure.
Probably. That's found
Okay.
on a number of other tunics. That
Cool.
sort of thing.
Man, you're a ringer. Should have had you teach the class or to Tim next time.
I'm just fascinated by all the variety of tunics, and with my focus, I look at a lot of stuff from Egypt. So
Oh, cool. This is a very, very early woman's tunic. This is the earliest one that I found to show you. Again, Egyptian, plain woven linen with tapestry woven decorative elements. Very typical, having the two vertical bars along the front torso and then having a pair of them along the sleeves. The dimension of this one are just what is super interesting, because when you see it laid out flat, my brain translate this as like, okay, t-shirt practically. But looking at the sizes, the height of 134 centimeters, that's 53 inches for all of us Americans. And then the width, including the sleeves, is over 2 meters. It's enormous. And even without the sleeves, just the body width is over a meter. So really, really interesting in terms of
yeah,
proportions,
the
and
clavia
fantastic.
right where the shoulders are. Those long things, those are right where the
Yes,
shoulders are.
yes.
I mean, I was mystified for a long time looking at these ones with these tiny sleeves, and then I'm like, oh, the sleeves start at the elbow.
Yeah, yeah. But but even, and so this might be also where I have not studied Persian costuming, but a friend of mine has garments where the sleeves are all ruched up at the forearm. So that must be some of where that is coming from. Having
Well,
something that,
sometimes the sleeves extend beyond the fingertips if you
yes.
let your arm relax, and they use them in dance, swaying
Oh,
long sleeves.
okay. I think I've seen some illuminations like that. But yeah, but this distance must be very, very wide too, because this is, somewhat less than half. So these sleeves are about 40 inches in circumference, front and back. Really, this would be fun to recreate, I have to say. This one, aside from the fact that it is this gorgeous red wool that is totally being set off by those magnificent decorations. This is one where it has that amazing profile of having the very tiny fitted sleeves on a huge body and then a tiny space for your head. But this neck opening, being about 12 centimeters on a side, would still be enough to, let's see, 12 centimeters is, yeah, just over 4 inches. So 4 of those are going to be, a little less than 20. So a person with a smaller head could absolutely fit into that space. But I love the fact that, again, we have this thing that is 50 inches wide and has a tuck to shorten the length. Super fun. So now, are there any questions on any of these examples before we talk about some how-to? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. Things that you need to sew a garment is, of course, you will need fabric. to make it out of. You will need your sewing supplies, and you will need to know how to lay this out. Because modern sewists are very often very dependent on paper patterns, whereas people who do a lot of historic sewing get a lot more practice in drafting, figuring out what shapes should look like, and laying everything out in simple rectangles, rectangles plus triangles, etc., on their fabric to get maximum fabric utilization. This is the simple style of tunic that I'm going to talk about in all the future examples. This is something that is going to be a great first project for you if you are new to sewing, if you are new to SCA costuming, and it's something that you can absolutely document and wear at an event and be comfortable and fabulous. In terms of fabric, of course, the extant examples that we have seen have been made out of linen. They've been made out of cotton. They have been made out of wool and silk. So again, you have the typical list of natural fibers. Obviously, hemp would be another great fabric to make these out of. And of course, if things like silk and wool and linen are out of the range of your budget, you can definitely make these out of some other fabric, just knowing that it might not have the exact best thermal qualities. It might have some better thermal qualities. It might have a better drape. But you can totally use like repurposed silk curtains that you find at the thrift store. You can make it out of a bed sheet that is like 50 cotton, 50 polyester, if that is what is accessible to you. All you need is a big block of fabric, like a large size sheet or, 4 or more yards of fabric. This is going to depend both on the width of the fabric and your own size. I tend to sew everything Magdalena sized because that's me and I'm so used to sewing for myself. I am 5'7". I'm about like a size 8'10". And so of course, all the measurements that I'm throwing out for like the things that I sewed for myself, there may not apply to you. But what was cool is seeing all of these extant garments from Egypt and looking at what size people were, because of course, the great thing about historical garments is that they were worn by real people, people who are now dead and have left their bones behind. So we have an idea of how large the average person was, the average man or woman. And so basically, the average sized man was about 5'6" in Egypt during the 5th through 8th century. So that's just about my size. So I thought to myself, if I make a tunic based on these dimensions, it will probably fit me vaguely accurately to how it fits someone back then. But if you are significantly taller than me, significantly broader than me, if you've got, a lot more bosoms than I do, you might need to adjust your fabric accordingly. One thing that I love to do at thrift stores is find an old wool skirt, some type of nice silk blouse. You could even look for an embroidered tablecloth or similar in order to find something that you can repurpose. Sunwolf, can you explain more about your question about are some period dresses just long tunics? Can you elaborate on that?
I'll go ahead and unmute. So, was it true that in some time periods in some areas, a woman's gown would basically be constructed in a similar way to what the tunics were worn by men?
Yes. So, I mean, we have seen with these examples, and probably the way that archaeologists are able to look at this, they can look at the decorative elements and say, this is what men typically wore, this is what women typically wore, or possibly they were part of burial examples. And so that way they could pull it into male or female. But, you know, on that level, human bodies are just the same. So you see long tunics that are identified as men's tunics. You see long ones that are identified as women's. You see, you know, the same breadth of fabric and the same style sleeves. But also, like, looking at all of the examples, like, I'm going to mispronounce it because my brain always loses some of the letters in Heralfnes, but the Greenland, Iceland site from the 14th century, where in that case, you know, male and female garments were all the same in terms of shape. It was just length. You know, men got to wear shorter tunics, whereas women were always wearing something that was made in the same way and just went all the way down to the ground.
Herjolfsness.
Thank you.
Herjolfsness.
Herjolfsness.
Yes.
I'll have to practice that, even though I have the book. So hopefully that answers your question. So there are ways that you can do trim on the cheap. You can talk to friends who, you know, who do tablet weaving or any sort of fancy weaving, get yourself some trim that way. But once you have these materials, always pre-wash your fabric. Pre-wash your trim if you're putting it onto the fabric, if you want to wash this garment in the future. And in case you haven't done a lot of this before, so fabrics like cotton, linen, definitely those vegetable fibers can be washed and dried in the washing machine. Some wool blends, like you can probably find like a wool poly blend with a nice drape, that can also potentially go into your machine, even though it might shrink down. I would recommend that you air dry that. And then anything that is sensitive, silk, different types of wool, those should definitely be washed by hand and then air dried. But what this does is that pre-washing will get some of the shrinkage out of the way, hopefully all of the shrinkage, as much of the shrinkage as you can get out of the way. It will get rid of any sizing that happens to be still on the fabric as part of the manufacturing process, which can be irritating. It can alter the drape or the hand of the fabric. It can stick to your iron if you're trying to press it. It can junk up your machine. So getting rid of that is great. And then for some fabrics, especially like Dupioni silk and some linens, and definitely everything on the red spectrum that has been manufactured in the normal process and not dyed by Michelle, those will probably still have a fair amount of dye in them. And so if you don't want that bleeding, that is definitely another thing that will come out during the pre-washing. Once you have washed everything, then get out your iron and your ironing board and press out all those wrinkles before you start cutting, because that will make sure that your lines are all nice and straight and make the fabric layout and cutting process so much nicer. And honestly, I love ironing fabric flat. It is so satisfying. Any questions or comments on fabric?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Um, Whenever you wash, if you haven't serged or hemmed your fabric, are you is there going to be an issue washing
Yes.
a full bolt of it, or however much you're going to wash, or um, do you need to seal those ends before you do that?
Yes. Thank you so much for bringing that up because I had forgotten. When I have like 5 yards of linen that I just bought that I want to pre-wash, I will zigzag both of those raw edges because otherwise it is going to start fraying. So definitely zigzag your edges, serge them if you have a serger. Even if you cut all of that off later, it will save you having a ton of threads in your machine.
Okay.
Okay, so if anyone has good links for sourcing nice affordable silk, please put that in the chat so that everyone can gain the benefit of your fantastic knowledge. Yeah, you know, there are times when I have pulled a piece of fabric out of the washing machine before I got in the habit of you know, serging those ends, and it's just everything is tied up in knots of those loose threads, and you have to just cut it all out. Sewing supplies. Here's my recommended list. So, a working sewing machine that you are comfortable using. You know, I say that you're comfortable using because I have tried sewing on totally unfamiliar sewing machines at a friend's house, and it was just not the best. Having a sewing machine that is in good repair, that doesn't have any weird effects, is a wonderful thing. Take your sewing machine to get a tune-up every year, every 18 months, and you'll be much happier. Thread to match or complement your fabric. I like to say complement because my grandmother was absolutely a person who would get a brand new spool of thread that perfectly matched her fabric for every project she was going to do. And so now that I have inherited her machine and her thread collection, I have got a gallon-sized Ziploc bag full of spools of various shades of red, which I am probably never going to actually use because I never buy orangey reds. But I could use one of those to complement some fabric. So if you're sewing natural linen, it's going to be very easy to find, you know, a good natural looking thread. If you've got something that is red, you're going to put a bunch of gold trim on it. You might have fun sewing it with a yellow thread. Obviously, they would have done something differently. I have not personally looked at the seams of these extant garments to figure out exactly if they were sewn with the exact same thread that they were woven with or something super similar. So I don't know how it was done in period. I like to have fun and not stress over my thread. For holding things together, you can use pins. They have special sewing clips if those are easier for you. Your scissors will make your cutting life so much better if they are nice and sharp and dedicated to use only on fabric. You will need fabric measuring tape, not only for measuring things on the fabric, but also for measuring yourself, and getting a yardstick or meter stick or even longer can also help a lot depending on how you like laying things out. So then, since we are going to be laying out a large swath of fabric, having it on your dining room table, even a very clean vacuumed floor, or your bed, I have laid out fabrics on all of these surfaces. They also make like cardboard fold up surfaces, grids, so that you can lay those out and have another surface that is very, very useful. I'm going to recommend an iron and an ironing board. This is a little bit optional. You can do without it if you don't have them. I'm also going to say good lighting, because it is so awkward being hunched over your sewing machine in a slightly dark room. I'm going to check the chat really fast just to see what people are saying. Oh yeah, putting your fabric in a pillowcase, definitely a good call. And I like Joanna's comment about how to know whether something that you suddenly find in your stash, if it's got a zigzagged edge, you know that you have pre-washed it. Awesome. So you're going to be generating your own tunic pattern based more or less on your own size. So don't stress out over this. It will totally work. If this is your first time attempting anything like this, go to the thrift store, grab yourself a queen size sheet, twin size sheet, something that you can just use as El Cheapo scrap fabric, and test out this layout. Then you can adjust everything before cutting into any of your nicer fabric. Definitely write these measurements down, do a little sketch, because that will help you see how everything fits together and what is going to be cut away. And then remember your seam allowances. Remember to basically accommodate for that. This is a large loose garment, so you can play a little bit fast and loose with seam allowances, as long as you know that you are adding enough ease to things. So in terms of how you need to measure yourself, first, decide how long that you want your tunic to be. Are you looking for something that is, it could be your shower tunic and only go down to mid-thigh because you're going to be wearing it on hot days walking to the shower. Could be super formal, going all the way down to your ankle. Maybe this is something out of a bit more fancy fabric that you're going to be wearing over something plain. And so it'll go down to the knee and you can see another layer underneath it. So just figure out how long it's going to be and then measure from the shoulder down over your body. Get a friend to look. I, always have to look down and just see where the tape measure is actually landing on my body to know that basically from shoulder to ankle is 52 inches. In terms of width, as you're setting this up, especially if you're thinking about making more of a streamlined tunic, so you want to measure all the way around the widest part of your chest with your arms down. Make a note of that number and then divide it by 2 because there is a separate front and back, and then add some ease. Ease is because if I made something going around my body that was exactly this measurement, it would be uncomfortably tight. And if I was doing it out of a sturdy woven fabric, I would not be happy at all because there would be no stretch. So on a tunic, it is good to have 2 inches of ease on the front piece and 2 inches on the back piece. So like 4 total. That would be a pretty good place to start. You can do more if you're accustomed to things being looser fitting, if you don't like being confined at all. As you get more practice in this, I know some ladies who will make an under tunic as more of a supportive garment. So they will actually do it pretty tight across the chest. So it helps to hold them in. So measuring for sleeves, there are 2 things that you're going to want to do. And hopefully I can show this on camera. Whenever you are measuring your arm, you want to bend the tape measure across your elbow to really maximize how long the sleeves need to be, unless you're going for a look where they ride up your wrists when you bend your elbow. And then the secret about arm size. Arm size is the word to describe the opening at the shoulder where the sleeve and the torso portions of your garment join together. If you say, measure around like the widest part of your arm and then flex your bicep to make it as big as possible, and think, this is the widest part of my arm. Okay, that might be the widest part of your arm, but your shoulder is actually much wider than that. And so then if you come up to your shoulder and you measure around this, and you realize, okay, that is another different measurement. And then you drop your arm and measure very vertically over your shoulder with your arm down. This is the number of how big your arm size needs to be comfortable if you've got sleeves that butt right into the torso. And this is why you see on some of the garments that they have a gusset under the arm, or they have an opening. The seam is actually open under the arm. That is just to get more space because arm size are weird. So, like for anyone who is keeping track, my bicep was about 13 inches and just around the very, very top of my arm was 15. But a comfortable arm size is going to be 18 inches plus ease. So it's so much bigger than you think it is. This is also why, for a nice fit, you see those tapered sleeves, because there is a big difference between the width at the arm side and then the width at the wrist, because my wrist is about 6¼ inches. So much smaller than the arm side. So finally, the last measurement is knowing how big around your head is, and you might want to try it in various places just to see. So I can tell mine is about 22¼ So you're going to need a neck opening enough to be able to comfortably get your head in without squashing any parts of your face. So once you have these measurements, write them down just for future use. So I drew some things out to hopefully be useful and illustrative. There are also online references. As I was looking around, everything seems to be on YouTube these days, and I didn't sit through everyone's YouTube videos on how to make a tunic. So definitely feel free to also watch some people's YouTube videos on how to make a tunic. But given your fabric, there's basically two ways that you can lay things out. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute so that hopefully my face can be nice and big and you can just focus on that. So here I have pieces of paper that are meant to represent fabric. And I've put this blue line on one side. Let me stop blurring my background so that it ceases to cut out. So you can see this blue line on the top and bottom. That is the selvage of your fabric. If you're new to this concept, the selvage is the long length of the fabric, and that is the finished edge that you will see. This is the raw edge, and this is sometimes, I call it the cross of the fabric because it is perpendicular to the selvage. So there's two ways to lay out your tunic. One is to take your fabric, fold it in half so that you've got long fold and then selvages together. And then you can lay out your T so that the shoulders are where the fold is and the bottom goes down, and you can just cut the neck opening out of this fabric. So this way, the width from arm limited by how wide your fabric is. So if you're a shorter person, like 5'2", 5'3", and you've got some 60-inch wide fabric, you might be able to totally get away with making a tunic that is just this wide. If you want to go for some of those more 2-meter wide tunics, or if you're a tall person with a wide wingspan, you're going to just need to orient your fabric a little differently. So here I have the same selvage to selvage, and I'm folding my fabric in half again, but I've laid out my T-tunic going the other way. So now your shoulders, you're going to sew these two selvages together on your shoulder seam. You can leave the neckline open, but this means that you can get a very, very long distance from wrist to wrist. You could even, depending on how long your fabric is, put the bottom on a selvage too and save yourself a little bit of the hemming step. This opening on this wrist is the one place where you're going to need to deliberately cut your fabric so that you will then have an opening. And then this gets sewn and this gets sewn. Hopefully that was useful. Let's go back to the tunic. And obviously let's fast forward to where I was. So given your fabric, let's say 4 yards of 54 to 60-inch wide fabric. So open it completely after it's been pre-washed and ironed, fold it in half, selvage edges on top, selvages on the bottom, a fold here, and then cut this open. So things that you want to note is, so first, mark down from the top, however wide you want your sleeves to be, accommodating from your arm side, or if you don't want the tunic, if you're okay with your tunic standing out from your body a bit, that can be less. Note where the center is, because you've got to have this center point in order to measure out for your body. If we're following the template of, say, a 6th century tunic, this distance is going to be 1 meter, 40 inches, fairly wide. Once you've got all of that marked, and it could be very useful to just take your yardstick, some chalk or a pencil, mark all of these lines, include a little bit for seam allowance. You can have a plain slit for the neck opening, or you can do a box or round opening. And once you have these two T's sitting on top of each other, do a seam across the top for your shoulders, a seam from the armpit to the wrist for the sleeve, and a seam from the armpit to the hem for the body. And then after that, so that you're not dealing with a bunch of raw edges, you want to turn under and do a little hem on the wrists and the neck and the bottom. This is also a place where if you suddenly try this on and think, oh my gosh, I totally mismeasured this length and this is now too long, or you think, okay, this was planned as an ankle tunic, but I'd much rather have it just be knee length for convenience, you can sew a big tuck across the middle to nicely shorten it. The second layout is a little bit different, and this is actually the one that I have used for the example that I made, which I'm going to show off in a minute, because I found that I had some very nice fabric to use for this, nice lightweight cotton that was about 41 inches in width. So I did this version, more or less where the selvages are on the side and there's a fold across the shoulders. So you can see this fold at the shoulders. I made my sleeves from separate rectangles and sewed them on to the middle of the body and then folded that entire thing to sew under the arm and down the sides. So this way was a little bit more fabric efficient and would work to give me a nice, very long tunic that still has the full width. But the overall sewing steps are the same. So one variation on this, as we transition to the later period, more streamlined tunic designs, if you want to have less in the torso and more around the hem, you can do something that's a little bit more trapezoidal. So again, we're doing the selvage to selvage, creating the length of your garment layout so that you can have sleeves as wide as you want them. So here are those selvages at the top and at the bottom. You'll mark the sleeves similar to what was done before. And then this is where you're going to get things a little bit more fitted into the body. So if you look at where these highly angled triangle points come together, that can be about half your chest, plus a little bit of ease. But the reason that I drew this a little bit differently is because this sharp angle is going to put a lot of stress right here on that fabric, and it's going to be awkward. So by easing this out, either with a vertical drop down and a little bit of extra width in the chest, or even thinking about curving this over, as we saw in that one tunic that did have some more sleeve shaping, you're able to get a lot more ease under the arm. The other thing about having some curvature there is that we have the selvage, we have the cross. If I had a diagonal line, this is called the bias of the fabric. And in woven fabrics, this is where you can actually get stretch in your fabric. So if I have a little bit of curvature there, I'm now using the bias of the fabric to give myself some stretch under the arm. And you'll look at this and you'll say, well, Magdalene, you've also got this going off at an angle. And I will say, yes, and that is not the best, because this is also on the bias and it's also going to stretch, which means that the edges of this tunic are going to naturally stretch down. And in addition to being the extra distance because of this angle, they now have a little bit of stretch and they're going to be lower than the front. So that can be a perfect style decision if that is your choice. But if you want to make sure that they're not dragging on the ground, you'll need to curve up your hem in order to cut some of that distance off. But still, this is a great way to make the easiest dress that you'll ever make in your life. That is my last slide. So let me show you really fast what I made. So one of the reasons I love that child's tunic is that it was striped, and I had this striped fabric in my stash. It feels like it's some sort of shirting fabric. I got it for free from a friend. And so I'm gonna have to actually stand back to show off the dimensions. So this is very comparable to that woman's tunic in the center, the body is about 110 centimeters in breadth. And in comparison, just these sleeves look so dinky. And it is the funniest thing. And then when I put this on, I'm gonna have to figure out how to wear it. And I'm sure that I can look up what they were doing. So just having the slit at the top for a neckline is really kind of fabulous. I haven't finished the edge yet, but I will. I think this would be good if I tapered the sleeves. And I know that these were all meant to be belted. So I've got this totally contrast belt to wrap around me. But now I can just kind of distribute the folds comfortably. I've got a lot of fullness here. So imagine if I had some additional ties like you see on all the Greek figures, that would sort all that out. Possibly some, you know, a nice brooch or fibula to help hold this excess. And the back just kind of goes where it is. But this is actually like a surprisingly cool fit for just trying this out with extant garment measurements. And another thing too, the breadth of the skirt is really good. So just walking around, kicking my legs up a bit, I'm able to get a really good distance. And so there's plenty here around my hips. So yeah, I'm totally chuffed.
That's not how it goes. So the red wool, the beautiful madder red wool tunic
Yes.
with the sewn-on decor that's just so exquisite that's in the V&A.
Yes.
The V&A has made a video of dressing someone in a reproduction of it so you can see how they were supposed to be worn.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm gonna have to go look that up. So yeah, you're gonna see me in this at some event in the future, possibly something during the summer, because I feel like this is going to be a great piece of summer kit. Are there any more questions, things that maybe I missed that you want to ask about? Any basic sewing questions?
Is there a special way that you might sew something differently if you're sewing for someone doing fighting of any sort, like rapier or chivalric fighting?
So for that, I would want to know how their armor will work out. So if you're sewing a tunic like this for a rapier fighter, I'm not entirely sure what the rules are these days, in terms of like how you would need to make it rapier legal, with fabric layers, or if this is something that just ends up being an overgarment and they're able to wear their protective kit underneath. Same with a heavy fighter, just understanding how it works with their armor. And then things that I would do is I would absolutely ensure that there were sizable gussets under the arm so that they have easy, full range of motion and their arm is not impeded at all.
Okay.
Okay, then there were some questions about finishing. I'm going to take this off really fast so that I can use it for an example. If you put your garb together well, it will last you a very long time. So one of the things that I learned in my many years of sewing that was actually one of the most useful classes that I took was in just finishing edges, whether it was a modern fashion or a period way. So right now, I'm going to turn this inside out because I just sewed this together last night and all my edges are unfinished. So I have a raw hem. And this hem, since it's just straight lines, I would probably cheat and do a French seam because they're very, very easy. I would at least take these edges, roll the raw edges under, and then tack that down so that there are no raw edges exposed. Doing the hem at the wrist, I just do a simple fold over once, press it, fold over again. So you lose some of the length and you might need to account for this as you're taking your measurements, but this way you don't have that raw edge exposed. The neckline is going to be a little bit more tricky. And this is also why I suspect you see all the various borders around the neckline, because especially if you've just cut a slit in your fabric, this point here is going to be very weak. What I can do with this edge is I can throw a tiny hem on it, just roll it over once, squish it flat, roll it over again so I don't have any raw edges exposed, little tiny rolled hem, and do that all the way around the neck. But I will want to do something to reinforce this stress point, whether that's slapping some embellishment right there, putting a bit of weaving right up against that edge, just so it doesn't feel that extra strain. The other thing that you see, and let me pull up one of these other tunics, that very nice, this one. I'll just zoom in. Two things that you see for the trim placement. You see it on that wrist, covering that raw edge, and you see it around the neck. So I suspect that this piece of extra fabric was used a little bit like bias tape, in that it was sewn to the raw edge and then folded over in the same way to finish that and make sure that there are no raw edges exposed. If you are doing this with doing this very nicely by hand, you can do this rolled hem just with a running stitch and an occasional back stitch. So the running stitch just going through, and then occasionally going through, coming back, looping back against yourself to prevent it from turning into a gather stitch. But I would definitely be tempted to turn the fabric over to not try to just do a buttonhole stitch to protect this raw edge. I would definitely turn the fabric over or use a type of facing. If we zoom ahead to one of these, so this one looks like it does have that same facing around the neckline, a little bit wider this time to make that decorative edge more distinct. Also, if you are making a style of tunic, I mean, honestly, like any of these, oops, that's not what I wanted. And the width that you have, if your sleeves ever end up being a little bit too short, you can slap some extra contrast decorative fabric on the end and have a great effect, very much like fancy blue tunic. So you can have this as an extra piece of fabric over, or it can be something that you use to extend your existing fabric if you find that you're running out of silk. Any more questions on the sewing process? If not, that is all that I have. I hope that you got something out of this, and find me in an event, contact me, message me on Facebook. If you ever need a sewing consultation, I would be delighted to help you make things for yourself and wear them proudly.
Thank you. That was amazing.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you
Now
so
we'll
much.
just